Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're privileged to be here with Dr. Byron and our ladies of the Tuskegee Airmen. I just want to clarify something for you, because sometimes we have three major categories of Tuskegee Airmen. Like Dr. Byron, he's an original. What that means is he served between 1941, June of 1941, to roughly June of 1949. That's roughly the period that Tuskegee Airmen, that originals, served. Now, heritage people, some are the spouses of original members. I'm a heritage member because I'm an offspring of a heritage member, former Tuskegee Army Airfield Fire Chief. So that's why I'm a heritage. Then we have what we call associate members. Now I want to make something clear to you. We do have some lovely women that are original Tuskegee Airmen. Some served as civilians at the Tuskegee Army Airfield. In fact, I live not too far from the original Tuskegee Airman, Melvin T. Jackson. His wife, the last wife I knew he had, was a supervisor in the parachute frigate shop. And we also had at Lockburn Air Force Base, the last physical area where Tuskegee Airmen served, we also had a WAF squad. So there are women, original Tuskegee Airmen. So I hope you understand it. Because in a way, this picture depicts the last base that Tuskegee Airmen were at. The reason I say it depicts that, at Lockburn Air Force Base, the commander of that base was B.O. Davis. And it pretty much, for all practical purposes, the leadership was all black. And all of the people, the maintenance folks, the food service people, the trainers, and at that base, it was called the 477 Composite Group, the last base Tuskegee Airmen served before. While integration was officially approved under Truman, it took a couple years after it was signed before they started breaking up these units. So I just want you to put that in proper perspective.
And may I interject that some of us are the wives of original Tuskegee
well, that's what I said.
And we were there during that period of time.
Yeah, there were wives at Tuskegee, there were wives at Godman, and there were wives at Lockburn, and all of them had some hard times getting places to live. Now that was a very, and a lot of those wives went through a lot. Some gave up jobs to be with their husbands. Now I was, as a youngster, the reason I'm so connected, other than being heritage, I was a paper boy, and before I went into service, and I served during Korea with 4 original Tuskegee Airmen, ones in our chapter, Woody Crocker. And I said B.O. Davis Jr. and Bill Campbell and George Spanker Roberts, who I babysat his older 2 kids when they were at Tuskegee Army. Now that aside. Now I usually acknowledge, because we love them, the Buffalo Soldiers, because there is a nexus between the Buffalo Soldiers and all, as it was indicated earlier, black Army or Army Air Force units. Now, one thing I want to point out, our trooper indicated about Lieutenant Flipper, and a chaplain. Well, they had to straighten out Lieutenant, the first graduate of the military academy, Lieutenant Flipper. It took a way long time before they got his record squared away to an honorable discharge. His bust is now at one of the buildings at West Point. And so, when we look at Lieutenant Flipper, the next 2, and which would include Colonel Young, as was indicated. There was Flipper, I can't think of the second. But anyway, the fourth person who we kind of know of, which is right there, he also went through that silent treatment at West Point. Now, a couple of matters that you may not know is, as it's been indicated, Colonel Young should have been the first general in our United States Army, but due to racism and all the other things that went with it, he wasn't. Now, the person that became the first general officer was B.O. Davis Jr.'s father. Now, he and another gentleman named Lee were what we call in the military Mustang officers. They were ex-enlisted to commission. And the reason I want to point that out because there was some nexus to us modern people. B.O. Davis Jr. became the nexus from his dad and became the first aviator in the United States Army Air Force. And there was a gentleman, Colonel Lee, who retired in '39. His son was a West Point graduate of 1950, who became one of the first U.S. Army engineers. And he served during Korea. And so, you know, we do have history and nexus between the beginning and the end. And it was kind of interesting, you know, that the first two real prominent that you all might know of, you know, were ex-enlisted. And they only had 2 ex-enlisted to get commissioned. And when World War II started, we only had 2 regular Army officers. Wow. That was father, B.O. Davis Jr., Brigadier General, and son. Now, we had some chaplains, about 3 chaplains, and that was it. Regular officers in our armed forces. And they emanated, in a sense, from the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, getting to Tuskegee Airmen. In 1925, at the Army War College that was then located in Kansas, a group of brilliant white officers determined that we, as people of color, Negroes as we were called then, we didn't have brains enough to be pilots. Now, B.O. Davis Jr. technically was the first person of the armed forces that flew in an Army Air Corps plane, because in 1935, when you're a West Pointer, you go through the junior year and you get a shot at looking at all of the branches of your service. Well, Davis, I think at field in New York, he did get a ride and all of the, you know, which you go through in case you were permitted into the Army Air Corps back then. Well, he also did apply to be a pilot in his last year at West Point, and he got that lovely letter back called rejection. And basically it was because the Army Air Force didn't want any persons of color in it, and they didn't have any intentions. So around 1939, when they finally passed something, the civil, civilian pilot training, CPT, about 4 or 5 black colleges got some people to get trained there. Well, you know, most people don't realize we would have had a march on Washington in 1940, but the Port and Porters Union, that's how B.O. Davis helped B.O. Davis Sr. get to be a general, so things cooled down. And on June 1941, before Pearl Harbor, blacks were part of the Army Air Corps. The enlisted people went to Chinook, and the pilots started their training at Tuskegee. It was called Tuskegee Institute back then. And I'm sure you know Tuskegee Institute is famous for Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And as Dr. Byers will tell you, the young ladies, and like me, we all went through the most famous spot in Tuskegee that you couldn't guess what that is. Chi Hall train station. about 8 miles from Tuskegee. And they had segregated, I don't even think it had when I went through there, it looked like it was a mud floor. But anyway, that was our nice, famous spot. Tuskegee was an interesting experience. And I want to say something to you folks, just for your own knowledge. Tuskegee Airmen originals do not wish you to ever call the Tuskegee experiment, because at the time there was an experiment in Tuskegee at the Veterans Administration Hospital. That's where they were injecting whatever you get with syphilis, and they were injecting people, males, with that black, and you weren't getting any treatment. Well, so when you talk to Tuskegee Airmen original, use the word experience, not experiment. Well, you'll slap me. But in all seriousness, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, that was probably one of the most wonderful things. And you know the reason the Tuskegee Airmen were successful? It's something young people don't do today. Even though he was an enlisted, kept them guns going, them 150 caliber machine guns in the wings of those aircraft. They all helped each other. If someone didn't know something, people that knew something pitched in. Same with the pilot classes. Some of you have probably seen that film about the Tuskegee Airmen. There are 2 mistakes. Hollywood has to have its pound of flesh. There's a guy named Hank Henry, who used to be our chapter's Speakers Bureau chairman. And well, anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt was not flown by an air cadet. She was flown by Chief Charles Anderson, who was one of the early certified pilots of color. He is the one that flew Eleanor Roosevelt. The second, grossly wrong, there has never been an aviation cadet of the Tuskegee Airmen that committed suicide because they failed to graduate. Heck, most of them knew. You know, when the 99th then Pursuit Squadron was created, and you had about 18 planes, everybody knew somebody wasn't going to make it. Wow, and at the first classes for over a year, they were taken on cream of the crop, the college people and all that. Now this picture up here depicts the first class. It was B.O. Davis Jr., then captain, and 12 air cadets. The people that first got their wings first was B.O. Davis Jr. as a captain, and the other 4 were air cadets. One of them was Spanky Roberts. Spanky Roberts was kind of Davis's number 2 guy throughout World War I up through 1945 before they went to Lockport Air Force Base. I knew Colonel Roberts on the base. I knew him as the ROTC guy in Tuskegee, and I knew him with the 51st Fighter Wing in Korea. So I have to admit I'm prejudiced. He's my hero and my mentor. But this is first class. Now this gentleman up here, some of these ladies, probably they've run into him. That was Melvin T. Jackson. Now Melvin T. Jackson, it was taken about a year ago. Melvin T. Jackson was 91 years old. He was a squadron commander of the 302nd. And he was a hero. He got his things fired. He shot down an enemy plane. Now, people will say during World War II, how come we didn't have a lot of aces, those that are looking at the John Wayne stuff? Well, the reason we didn't have a lot of aces, this was our only ace. Our only ace was Lee A. Archer, who just got married a week or so, maybe 2 weeks ago, at Arlington. So deserved. General, then Colonel Davis, up all through his whole career, West Pointer, spit and polish. Well, when the 332nd went over, and they got the assignment to be escort the bombers, and all of the bomber crews were white. The good colonel said, do not leave your escort. Or if you did, I have something wonderful for you when you land. They knew what that would be. So that's why the escorted was, I don't care what anybody says, I don't think there was any fighter group that escorted any better throughout World War I, even though pilots exaggerated and all that good stuff. I think it deserved its record, it deserved the Presidential Unit citation that it gave.